Cynthia McCaffrey and Professor Sunstein. It is such an honor to be moderating today's event. My name is Alexandra De Filippo, and I work for the Behavioral Insights team, leading the International Programs Division out of the New York office. It is also really exciting to be speaking about the role of behavioral insights in pushing the 2030 agenda, strengthening and advancing the goals that so many leaders have confirmed this week during the General Assembly. We heard from so many of them as they urged us to think about new ways that we could do international development and public policy around the world, urging us to think about better ways to be more user-centric and more adaptive to the challenges on the ground. Indeed, the SDGs are a very ambitious agenda. At their core, they want to tackle some of the most complex and entrenched challenges of our time, including poverty and gender and income inequality. Such an ambitious agenda demands that we use every tool in our toolbox to really unlock progress in areas where progress has been elusive, and where so many of the challenges are interconnected and really just complex. BI is one such tool. Behavioral insights is one such tool. It can help us understand how people behave, how they make decisions, and how the context in which they make decisions affects their choices. Over time, we've seen how behavioral insights has moved from a tool into more of a lens that we can use to design programs, laws, and policies that take into account how humans behave. In fact, the organization I work for, the Behavioral Insights team, or Nudge Unit initially, was one of the first organizations in government tasked with the mission of making policy for the way that humans actually behave, as opposed to the way that we wish they would behave. And over time, we've seen how behavioral insights has aimed to address ever more complex challenges. So initially, we looked at compliance and how do we get people to pay taxes or comply with the law or regulation. But now behavioral insights is applied around the world to think about how to reduce violence, how to get people to get better access to services, education, etc. And today we'll be hearing more about that. I wanted to share 3 examples from our work with the UNDP and other agencies. The first one comes from the field of health, where small technologies can help improve the way that we are delivering healthcare to the people in most need. In Mexico, a 2-way SMS system with Prospera Digital has helped us improve maternal outcomes by giving women better information and simpler ways of knowing what to do to prepare for childbirth. In Moldova, in partnership with the UNDP Innovation Facility, we saw how a 2-fold increase in adherence to medical treatment for tuberculosis just by allowing patients to take their treatment using an app or just being observed virtually, not having to go in person to a clinic to take their medicine. So those are very simple technologies that can help improve the way that we are delivering healthcare to the people in most need. The second example comes from our work with the International Rescue Committee in humanitarian settings, where we've been thinking about how to involve parents, how to teach them, but also engage them in the development of their children early on, ages 0 to 5. And this is in the Syria response, where, of course, the situation is quite difficult for them, and even just knowing what to do can be a challenge. And also in humanitarian settings, we've been working with teachers to reduce corporal punishment and use positive discipline techniques, which, as you know, can be a problem in many parts of the world. And lastly, I wanted to share a little bit about our work with the UNDP Innovation Facility to address gender-based violence around the world, particularly thinking about how to get survivors to access services and reach safety, and also how to understand the barriers that bystanders face in helping survivors. Why are they not intervening in their communities, and how can we make it easier for them to do so? Equally, also thinking about how to shift the social norms that sustain gender-based violence. This is just a snippet of the world that is happening around the world to bring behavioral science to do good for the people who most need it, and to actually achieve the goals of the 2030 agenda. Today, we'll hear a lot more from people in the UN family doing this work on a daily basis. So let me preview today's event. We'll first hear from the UNDP Bureau of Policy and Program Support, which hosts the UNDP Innovation Facility. And then we'll hear from UNICEF's Office of Global Innovation. They will both share examples of the work they are doing day to day to make behavioral insights a part of their agency's work and to improve outcomes for people around the world. In fact, the fact that this is a joint event by two agencies really shows how innovation is bringing people together. The UN Innovation Network joins the UNDP, UN Women, UNICEF, the UN Sustainable Development Group, the World Food Programme, amongst others, helping them come together in a place to coordinate their work and really push innovation for all this to tackle these challenges that require a coordinated response. And then we'll hear from our keynote speaker, Professor Cass Sunstein, who has been a global leader in bringing behavioral insight and experimental ways of making policy into and experimental ways of making policy into the public sector. And we're really inspired by his work and can't wait to see what he thinks now that Nudge turns 10. So before we hear from our first speaker, let me share a guiding question for today, which is, how do we move from a portfolio of behavioral interventions or solutions that sometimes seem isolated into a more systematic way of using them across organizations? And I hope that our speakers today will have a lot to say about this. So let me introduce our first speaker, Assistant Secretary General Mark Dia. He leads the UNDP Bureau for Policy and Program Support, which hosts the UN Innovation Facility. He's been a staunch supporter of innovation across the agency, and as part of the work of the facility, they've been encouraging entrepreneurs to try and test new ways of thinking and working. It's a real pleasure to hear from you.
Thank you, Alessandra. Dear Cass, Cynthia, and dear colleagues, welcome to what I see as a seminal moment. Since Monday, I've been attending many side events. I think this is my 33rd, and I have more during the day, but I canceled them because I said, no way, I'm going to miss this moment. And Cass, this is your moment. So if you would allow me, I would minimize my remarks so that we can maximize the space that we give to you, because I'm sure that all of us are here to listen to you as the guru of BI. But let me, Alessandra, I was going to give them a rundown of what we have been doing ourselves as in Behavioral Insights, but you stole my show.
Oh, sorry.
Which is very good, because this is precisely behavioral insight, how I change my behavior listening to what you have done. So I will shift my perspective and try to see if I can find another course of action. We'll see, I mean, at the end of the day, how critical behavioral insight is, how it is shaping the way we do economics, how it is shaping the way we do political economy, how it is shaping the way we manage our own institutions. But let me first give you a sense of my first encounter with behavioral insights. A few years ago, a long time ago, when I was a young economist, I went to Senegal, my own country. I'm from Senegal, Dakar, and I went with my wife to the market. I'm an economist, she is a philanthropist. There's no contradiction between the two anyway. And we went to the market, and she saw an old lady selling dolls. And she had 10 dolls she was selling. And my dear wife came, saw her, and said, well, Madam, Mom, I'm going to buy the 10 dolls. Here's the money. I buy it so you can go home and dress to old women and so on and so forth. She screamed at her. Who the hell are you to buy all my 10 dolls? And my wife said, well, you take it, you go and rest, and then may you have a moment, you can buy other stuff and so on and so forth. And she replied, look, if I sell you my 10 dolls, what about the other customers? that are coming to buy dolls. You are selfish. And by the way, if I sell you my dolls, what do I do with the rest of my time? So I told my wife, you're giving her a lesson of rational economics. She's giving you a lesson on behavioral insights. She's telling you that economics, I'll come back to it, is not that rational way of expectation of doing things. She's telling you that her insight, her behavioral insight is societal. It's not pure economics, it's how do I deal with people, how do I enjoy my life, and so on and so forth. So that was my very encounter with that behavioral insight. And when she screamed, and later on, when I read your work on what we call the Lockean exclamation, I understood it extremely well. I mean, you know, John Locke, you remember where he said that, who are you to tell me what to do or not to do? And that lady was telling my wife, who are you to tell me what to do or not to do? Respect my behavior. And that is extremely important. And let me give another example where we missed it. When the new, in the political economy, when the new country named South Sudan was born, we all came, all the international community, to support South Sudan, the state, and we wanted to make it a success of the world. And we missed it. Why? Because we didn't take into account lessons from behavioral insights. We thought that by investing in the states, that will do it. We ignored that the state was just an emanation of social contract and social construct. We don't have a society already integrated and solid in South Sudan, so that we can out of it create a state that will run it. So we miss it. Instead of investing in bringing the society together, strengthening the social construct, strengthening the social contract, we went straight to the state. So again, a lesson in political economy that missing behavioral insight can have terrible consequences. Look today what is happening in South Sudan. I'm glad that we are having this insight from BI as we are reshaping the economics. We all know, even today, economics is basically, the fundamentals of economics is Newtonian, classical physics that we apply and then translate it into economics. Put simply, it is like, let me put a kind of algorithm, X, then Y. And between X and Y, we put our own models of intermediation. X through intermediation will give us Y. Prescriptive policy and then results. And we know it doesn't work. Especially now that we are in an area of complexity, in an area of instantaneity. Space has been contracted, as Karl Marx said once. His time is contracted. It's extremely difficult. And we are in a situation, a civilization, a culture of instantaneity. People want solutions now. And our classical Newtonian way of doing economics is not it. I understand why we call economics the dismal science, because first, it's not a science, it's not a physical science. Behavior matters well, and I think we really miss it. I'm glad that we have today people like Cass who can guide us, correct those misunderstanding, missteps, especially now that we are dealing with these 17 goals that are staring at us. But for 3 years now, we have failed to deal with them. And the way we are approaching it is not right. We think that by having the trillions of dollars that is missing there, we can deal with it. No. When I look at them, I am reminded by one of my favorite authors, Emmanuel Kant, who I read it in French, Critique de la raison pure. In English, they say critique of pure reason, I think. When he said that when you look at a phenomenon like this that is staring at you, go to the noumen, go inside it, get to the soul, unless you get to the soul, you can't solve the phenomenon. And that's the problem we have now. And I trust that with insights like Cass, we can go inside the 17 goals, get to it, get to the noumen, and then solve the solution. This is what we expect to do today. Cass, that's why I say this is your moment. I will give you that space. But let me end by saying that in UNDP, we are trying to reinvent the way to do economics. As I said earlier, this Newtonian way of prescriptive policies doesn't work. We believe in sui generis policy making based on experimentation, experiencing, I would say even presencing. Those who have read the book on presencing, go inside you to go to your soul and to find the solutions. We, under the leadership of my colleagues here, Bernardo and Ben, and Akim Steiner, we are having what we call the acceleration labs. The lab was precisely is the moment where we do policy sui generis based on the context, based on experimentation, because we don't know ex ante what to do ex post. The context would dictate it. And I think by building on the behavior of the actors, of the context and the situation, then we can find the solutions. So that's my opening space. Again, I don't want to steal the moment. This is Cass, your moment. Cynthia, thank you for organizing this. This is a great partnership, UNICEF, UNDP, and UN Women. We are a little bit the crusaders, the vectors in opening the way for BI in the way we do business. And thank you for coming. You will enjoy the moment once we land the day. Thank you.
So, well, I'm sorry for stealing your thunder, but not really, because that was wonderful. And we heard a little bit more about the impetus for applying behavioral insights and actually how it applies to the work that you do and what you see on the ground. So I'm not that sorry. I'm sorry. Our second speaker comes from UNICEF. She's Director Cynthia McCaffrey, and she leads the UNICEF's Office of Global Innovation. In that position, she is in charge of forming partnerships around the world to use frontier technologies to improve the way that UNICEF works, but also to improve ultimately the lives of children around the world. And we're really excited to hear more about how you've been using behavioral insights at UNICEF and how you've been kind of like mainstreaming innovation there.
Okay, first of all, not fair that I go after Mar because he's so good. So I'll see how that affects my behavior and my talk. And then second, just a lot of pressure, Professor Sunstein, in terms of what you're going to do. Mar set you up very well. So I just wanted to, I also really want to cut to the chase and see what we can hear and the insights that we can get from outside, which is one place that I would start, and just thank UNDP in particular for bringing this insight from outside, which I think is extremely important in terms of our listening as a UN family to those experts from outside and their experiences. I would just say three things around this topic that would be important, I think, for us to listen to and to learn from. One is that it's not new. We've been trying to build on this, and I think both of you, Alexandra and Mar, you both said these are efforts or projects that we've been trying to see, and at UNICEF it's no different. Through our Communication for Development, which of course we never call it that, we call it C for D. Over the years, we have seen by focusing in on behavioral issues and insights, we're able to get mothers to breastfeed and then to breastfeed longer. We're able to get families to pay attention to getting their children vaccinated and completing those vaccinations. And that has been a major hurdle that we've seen. It's the behavioral understandings and insights that have enabled us to make that progress. But you're right, often it's been seen as little projects, and how do we look at those and bring those together? Which would bring me to my second, which is how do we make it systemic and systematic, particularly as the Sustainable Development Goals are staring us in the face. And we say, and I think I've heard it several times this week, the other issue that I have with Mar is I have not been to 34 meetings, but I feel like saying I've been to 35 or 36 just to top him. But I've been to a few, and we've heard no business as usual. We're going to have to approach this differently. And behavioral insights is a major tool for us to do that. How do we really look at this and systematically and systemically apply this? UNICEF with partners has seen efforts that really work. So things like, you talked about SMS. We have a tool, a platform that's open source that we've worked with partners like UNDP and others, YouReport, to talk to young people, to hear from them, and then to take action based on that. So in Cameroon, working with getting people on YouReport, finding out that they're not vaccinating their children and working with them to get the right messages to them to really complete their vaccination. Secondly, is using tools like the Internet of Good Things is a tool that UNICEF has, and by putting messages on there that's available in real time and on cell phones, which is where people are, is giving those messages so that they can be able to understand what the issues are, see what their behavior is, and see how a change in behavior can make a tremendous difference. One of the things is we will often quote numbers. We'll often talk about how many millions of people we have on Internet of Good Things, how many countries we're in, how many people are getting messages. But I think the important issue is the impact it has. When people go on the Internet of Good Things, over 70% of them say that is a message that resonated, got to me at the right time, and enabled me to change my behavior, to make a difference in a different decision of what I was doing. And I think that's the insight that we have to have is, where is this having an impact? How are we knitting it together? The final thing is partnership, is really working together. And I would start with, when I first came to UNICEF a few years ago, Mar was one of the first people who reached out to me and said, why don't we work together? Why don't we, in the different positions that we were at the time with our front offices, share information? Why don't we, when your principal's upset, you give me a call, see if we can talk him off the ledge, and I'll do the same thing. And it was incredible. It was such a different behavior to say, we're just across the street, why don't we do that? And then we decided to invite some others. Remember, Mar? We brought in UN Women, we brought in UNFPA and said, hey, we're all leading front offices, why don't we work together? And it really started a tradition of sharing information and figuring out how we would behave differently to help get our principals to behave differently. It's the same here today. This is really UNDP coming to us and saying, hey, let's do this together and have a joint event. But it's also the public sector, the private sector, academia, that has information, networks, resources that we can and all have to be using. And I think that's one of the things that's really important as we come out of here from this week and from this day and this talk, is how do we grab these cards that we're all handing out and really talk about the projects that we're doing in small ways, knit them together systematically, and partner in a way that's new and different. So I'm really looking forward to your insights. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a fantastic summary of what BI is trying to do at the moment, which is, one, really putting ourselves in the foot of the people who will ultimately be benefited by it, and diagnosing and designing programs for them, but also looking internally and looking at institutions and mass bureaucracies and saying, what can BI tell us about ourselves? That will be another question potentially today, especially in the following event, where a few, people from different agencies will be meeting and asking Professor Sunstein for advice on how to institutionalize BI going forward. So without further ado, let's hear from Professor Cass Sunstein. He is the founder and director of the program on behavioral economics and public policy at Harvard Law School. From 2009 to 2012, he was the administrator of the White House Office for Information and Regulatory Affairs. I think that kind of understates Professor Sunstein's impact. As someone working in the field, he has really shaped what behavioral insights has become. He was one of the pioneers bringing behavioral insights from theory really to a language that was practicable. And I know, for example, that the organization I work for, the Behavioral Insights team, would not exist if not for his work. He is a celebrated author of many, many books. Of particular interest today is Nudge, which just now turned 10, and it's a book on improving decisions about health, wealth, and happiness with Professor Richard Thaler, who won a Nobel Prize on economics for his work on behavioral insights. And that really brought behavioral insights to the forefront of policymaking and got people asking, how can we apply this in our work? Of course, since then, he has been busy writing other 22 books, anything from the cost-benefit revolution, most recently, to books on law, and even Star Wars. So definitely someone who can tell us a lot from a lot of different fields, and we're really excited to hear what you have to say today. Thank you.
Well, it's a tremendous honor and completely inspiring to be here. And I've already heard a good deal about the work you all are doing, and it is completely thrilling. So I want to start by telling you about the application of behavioral insights in my country. Can you guess from my accent what is my country? Yes, I'm from South Africa. No, the United States. And this is an application of behavioral insights, which is half wonderful and half catastrophic. And I hope you'll see why, and it'll contain a general lesson. So there was a company not long ago that would call ordinary citizens and say, we have a program for you by which we will give you discounts at hotels and other businesses for a monthly fee. And think of the country which Americans are least likely to go to, and that's the country where they get a discount on the hotel. Or if you're very much interested in microwave ovens that haven't been built yet, once they have been made, we will give you a 5% discount. It's a program. Would you like to sign up? It's a fraudulent program. A number of people nonetheless signed up. They thought it sounded good, and the telemarketer was convincing. So it was fraud. And the government went after the company and said, this is unlawful. The court agreed. This was unlawful. Then the question is, what is the court's solution to this fraud? They have a large number of people in the program. And think to yourself, what is the reasonable solution to the fact that large numbers of ordinary people are losing every month money because they're in a program which they are highly unlikely to be benefiting from? The court did one very intelligent thing. It said, if you've been in the program for a relatively short time, approximately a year, our decree will be you are out of the program, and the company has to send you a letter saying, if you want to be in the program, you have to respond saying, I am informed and I want to be in. That's intelligent, because what we know about human nature suggests that people are going to throw the letter away. That's good, because it's a fraudulent program. We don't want people signing up. If they love the program, if they want the microwave ovens that haven't been built yet, they're probably never going to be built, they can sign up. And in fact, the number of people who joined the program was approximately 0 after the company sent the letter out. That's successful application of a behavioral insight. It suggests the immense power of inertia. Here's the thing the court did that could have benefited from the work of some of the people in this room and was not a success. For people who'd been in this program, and think of this as a highly fraudulent, terrible abuse of consumers, people who'd been in the program for a long time were receiving a letter saying, you will stay in the program unless you send us a letter saying you don't want to be in anymore. Do you see the problem? A large number of people are not benefiting from the program or getting anything out of it, but they're busy and they are dealing with their children and maybe medical issues and maybe educational issues and maybe 5 to 15 things on the list of 17. And that means that the vast majority of people who received the letter stayed in the program. That was a behaviorally uninsightful intervention. Okay, what the court did basically with both approaches was a nudge. In sending the letter saying you're out of the program unless you say you want to be in, people were being nudged. The court also nudged people with the letter that said you are going to stay in the program unless you sign up. What both of those interventions are behaviorally informed approaches that steer people, but that preserve freedom of choice. So in no case was the letter a little elephant, but it operated like a little elephant pushing a smaller elephant. Okay, I was lucky for 4 years full-time as an occasional advisor for the rest of the time, informal occasional advisor, to work for President Obama. In the Oval Office, people aren't always smiling. That was a very good moment. Maybe we had something successful that we were discussing. And the job I had was to oversee government regulation through this office with the less than charming name, the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs. Now, what I'm going to try to do is combine an understanding of institutional detail, which will be practical, with an understanding of behavioral insights, which will be more theoretical, and try to say these twain shall meet. The practical and the theoretical are going to be partners. The overseeing of regulations, which has parallels in the work of many governments and many partnerships in which the UN is involved, has veto authority. So what is of central importance in terms of that institution, which President Ronald Reagan created, is that it can say to the Environmental Protection Agency, it can say to the Department of Health and Human Services, it can say to entities engaged in protecting civil rights for women and sex equality, it can say, no, you can't do that. And the power to say no has a special feature, which is that it includes yes, if. The power to veto means you can say yes if you do it this way. The scope of the authority is very broad. It includes education, certainly clean water, health, immigration, transportation, homeland security, and much more. The office is small, like many behavioral insights teams. It is much broader than a behavioral insights team. It contains 50 people, and those 50 people are working closely with hundreds, and in the course of the year, probably thousands of other people in the US government to try to make the policies as good as they can possibly be. Okay, I want to give you some institutional color by exploring how policies are influenced by this entity. And you can see entities that are formally very similar to this, or that have a more advisory information gathering role that can do one or more of these things. So something that I found was extremely congenial and often collaborative and productive was to pick up the phone. You don't want it on email, always, sometimes. But if it's a tentative idea, better to be tentative about it. Pick up the phone and say to, for example, the Secretary of Agriculture, would you be interested in trying this? It might make food safer. It may make farmers more productive. And the Secretary of Agriculture would then say, that's an idea. Let me take it up with my staff. Let's our staffs work together. So the immense power of collaboration through behaviorally informed ideas, which may involve something like changing the default rule from opt-in to opt-out, and seeing what kind of action emerges from that. President of the United States has the power to issue executive orders, and many officials have the power to do something similar. I was just speaking to someone in the United Kingdom who is a minister who has the power to do the equivalent of executive orders, which are binding. They are law-like, though they're not enforceable in court. They might say, you must do this, or they might say, please consider that. And it could be a very particular initiative, saying, for example, ensure that people are reminded on a periodic basis of this program so they can benefit from it. Or it may be something that is more advisory, saying, consider the possibility of these tools. The Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs has the authority itself to issue binding memoranda saying to the rest of the government, you must do this, this, that, and that. And those memoranda, which of course are issued as a result of a collaborative process, not because of one person, have fueled the use of behavioral insights all over the United States government. The power to review regulations, to say yes, but only if, can be a way of developing behaviorally informed approaches that are effective. Every automobile in the United States now comes with a fuel economy label, which is intended as a way to help consumers, and particularly consumers who don't have a lot of money, to save money by having fuel-efficient cars, and also to help make the environment cleaner by making sure that cars are better in terms of air pollution. That is serving at least two of the Sustainable Development Goals at the same time. And it's just a nudge, it's just information. And it actually developed as a result of review of regulations saying, try this. We now have in the United States a requirement that every car has a camera in it so that you can see in back. That rule seems like a technical fix, but it is ensuring that children between the ages of 1 and 4 are never, basically, killed in back-over crashes by their parents. And while the numbers aren't very large, we're talking about the most searing and basically unlivable event you can imagine in a parent's life. And this regulation, which the Trump administration has enthusiastically supported, emerged through conversations that were trying to figure out a behaviorally informed way to improve safety. Behaviorally informed because when people buy cars, they're not always thinking, what are the risks that if I drive backwards, I won't be able to see well enough? And behaviorally informed as well by virtue of the fact that if you put the camera in the car, then people's attention is going to be focused as they're backing up on what's behind them in ways that might not work if they are just resorting to mirrors. The Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs also has an authority, which I hope everyone who's listening will remember, which is paperwork review. And I admit that my hope is a little bit unrealistic because who could remember the word paperwork review? But I want to put it in big, bold letters because many programs, private and public, are not working because the paperwork form-filling process is too cumbersome and difficult. The fact is there are well-designed programs all over the world in France and Rwanda and the United States and Germany that were much better if there was an intense focus on whether the paperwork requirements for participation are excessive. And the usual answer to the question, are they excessive, is yes. I'm going to give you some policy success stories just as an example of behaviorally informed approaches. And my hope is that whether the particular reform or not resonates with the problem that you're concerned with, the instrument that's used to solve the problem will be generally usable. So automatic enrollment and savings plans in many countries, including Denmark and the United Kingdom and the United States, are phenomenally successful in creating higher participation rates. A shift from an opt-in design to an opt-out design massively increases participation. And that attacks the problem of poverty among the elderly extremely effectively. Here's a little finding that I confess seems to me so surprising I can barely believe it, but it's true. In Denmark, the impact of automatic enrollment and savings plans is much bigger than the impact of significant tax incentives. That shouldn't happen. There have been Nobel Prizes awarded for theories that suggest that that can't happen. Incentives matter. Gary Becker got the Nobel Prize for that. The default rule doesn't matter. Ronald Coase got the Nobel Prize for that. And yet, incentives don't much matter. The default rule really matters. Now, what's a spectacularly generalizable fact about that finding and the power of automatic enrollment is in many areas it's tempting to throw money at problems to create incentives. Sometimes that's not necessary. Just change the architecture. Calorie labels are in place in this country, the United States. New York was a pioneer. The recent data suggests if there's a calorie label, people are taking in less calories. And that has a very important impact on health. It counteracts the worldwide epidemic of obesity. And it's an inexpensive intervention. It's just information. There's a law in 2009 based on behavioral work that suggests that we can help consumers a lot save money with respect to credit card use, and the larger game is debt in general, by giving them information and changing the architecture on their credit card bill so that they can see what happens with a late fee or overuse fee. The consequence of the law, astonishingly, is to save consumers over $10 billion annually. And the most beautiful feature of the intervention is that the benefits, those $10 billion, they're concentrated among people with low credit ratings, which means not only is the aggregate effect beneficial, it's getting at exactly the population that's most vulnerable. The cost effectiveness data is suggesting that interventions of this kind, behaviorally informed, freedom preserving interventions, often give you more bang for the buck, meaning that per euro, you will get more benefit than from mandates and incentives. The idea of modest incremental impact is a myth. In the cases you've just heard, we're not talking about modest incremental impacts, and I'm going to give some other examples. Okay, for a simple definition of that form of behaviorally informed intervention that qualifies as a nudge, think of a GPS device as the defining example. And here is what I think our book most would have benefited from adding. So a more kind of direct way to put it is what I most regret, what I've learned in the last 10 years that should have been in the book, is that human beings all over the world, in the developing world, in some ways more than in wealthy countries, but in both, suffer from is a problem of navigability. Both policymakers and philosophers, economists and philanthropists, theologians and lawyers, all have devoted too little attention to the fact that if people have freedom of choice, that's great, but often they don't know how to get from here to there. Where from here to there might be to a doctor, it might be to schooling, it might be to employment, it might be to clean air. And the absence of the equivalent of a GPS device is the obstacle to their enjoyment of freedom and rights. A GPS device is just about something, partial in people's lives, but in all aspects of lives, we can benefit from a GPS. This is, forgive me, a somewhat scandalous slide, not that scandalous. It is a urinal, but it's a world historical urinal, that it's a urinal at the Netherlands airport, and there is a fly painted on the urinal. And the reason the fly was painted on the urinal was to reduce a problem, the problem of spillage. The effect of the fly has been to reduce spillage by 44%. Don't ask me how they know that. Apparently, men can't help but aim at the fly. Now, the reason this is a profound piece of data is that frequently in life, our programs don't paint a fly. And human cognition is such that the fly is necessary, whether it involves money or health or education. We need to signal to people clearly so it's in their view screen. Okay, this is a postcard a friend sent me from Germany, and I don't speak German, but I think I understand the postcard. It suggests that nudges can go wrong. Okay, I mentioned automatic enrollment can have a massive effect on savings. You're observing here that at every end of the income distribution, an increase from an opt-in design to an opt-out design significantly increases employment. And the general thought for policymaking is that often we have an opt-in design and it needs to be replaced by an opt-out design. Education is a central concern of the goals. It's one of the 17. In some ways, it has pride of place, I think, because education is a precondition for everything else. Here is a little bit of recent data that is, I think, massively informative. There is a program that's designed to help parents use a process, a technological process, to help their kids learn more. In opt-in, the participation rate is about 1%. It's pathetic. If it is simplified, if the process for participating is simplified, so it's easier for parents, it grows up to 11%. That's very good. It's not good enough. If you would change the process to one in which they are automatically enrolled and they can opt out, participation rates are 95%. The switch of the default from opt-in to opt-out changes the rate from about 1% to about 95%. Simplification is much closer to the catastrophic opt-in, to the smashingly successful opt-out. And district leaders, these are people whose job it is to know the answer to what policies work. They overestimated the failed program by about 40%, and they underestimated the successful program by about 30%. Not because they're inexperienced, but because an understanding of the weakness of opt-in and the power of opt-in, opt-out, it's just not intuitive in the human mind. Okay, here's an executive order from President Obama. It's still in effect under President Trump. It's actually been embraced by President Trump in terms. And it has a very charming name, a behaviorally informed name, Executive Order 13563. Okay, the behaviorally informed people in the room are saying, how could you have called it that? We had to, they have to have numbers. And this is a provision that basically calls out the Olympic gold medal winner and the Olympic silver medal winner in terms of behavioral insights. Olympic gold, default rules. You've heard a few examples, and it says, use them. It directs the federal government, use them. The silver medal winner is information, as in the case of calorie labels, and it says, use that. And it says more helpfully than use information, do it in a form that is clear and intelligible. That is behaviorally informed. There's an Executive Order 13707. That's a little better than 13563. I work on this stuff and I can barely remember these things. These are my family members and I can hardly remember their names. 13707. It should have been 13333. Yes, that would have been better. Okay, they're both worth attention because 13707 is a lengthy, you're just seeing the beginning of it, embrace of behavioral insights and a direction with particularity by the president to the rest of the government, do this. And it is binding. There is in the United States government something like the Behavioral Insights team in the UK. It's called the Office of Evaluation Sciences. And the only noteworthy thing I think about the title is it puts the spotlight on testing and evaluating empirically. And the quotations here are directly from the website. It is an advisory group which works with the federal government, all agencies in the government, to find good tools by which to help solve problems. Okay, I'm giving you here 5 behaviorally informed tools. And what's important about the first 2, which is default rules and increased convenience, is they pick up on the fact that if a program isn't working or if people aren't being helped, the first thing to do is to make it easier for them. Now, default rules are kind of gold medal winners because they don't just make it easy, they make it automatic. Increased convenience makes it easier. And doing those things often have extremely large effects. Information, warnings, and reminders are all in the family of the silver medal winners. And the reason the reminders have 2 asterisks next to them is they are the sleeper, I think, of 2018 behaviorally informed interventions. Often if people are suffering in one or another way, and there's something that can be made to help them, a reminder turns out to be the tool of choice. Not an economic incentive, certainly not a punishment or a threat, just a simple reminder. And what that picks up on is the fact that human attention is limited, and a reminder responds to that fact. Telling people about what the social norm is has been an extremely productive intervention to reduce pollution, to reduce opioid prescriptions, to increase tax paying. And I think we're just at the tip of the iceberg now in terms of uses of social norms to attack problems like gender-based violence and other forms of deprivations of sex equality. Okay, so we're talking about interventions that affect behavior without punishment, fines, or subsidies. There's something friendly and respectful about these interventions. Here are 3 reasons why the interventions have worked, and these are responses to some things we know about human nature. Human beings, and there are good evolutionary reasons why this should be true, are unrealistically optimistic. 90% of drivers think they're better than the average driver. Smokers have a sense of the statistical risks of smoking often, but smokers have been found to believe that they personally are less at risk than the average non-smoker. They know the statistical risk. They think their personal risk is lower than that of the average non-smoker. A belief in relative personal immunity from risk is literally life endangering. And the behaviorally informed approaches are counteracting optimistic bias, either through a warning or reminder, or by architecting people into something that is safe. We know that human beings are focused on today and tomorrow. People suffer from present bias. Sometimes the future seems like a foreign country, later land, and people aren't sure they're ever going to visit. Now, with respect to challenges that involve health or the planet, present bias can be deadly. If you're engaged in behavior that is fine today and tomorrow and next week, but going to create long-term problems, either through a cumulative adverse health impact or through a financial effect that is going to be damaging 15 years down the road. The human mind is wired, again, for evolutionarily understandable reasons, on escaping the tiger that's chasing you now, not on the tiger that might come 10 years. The behavioral approaches are often designed to overcome present bias. This is based on a little film, this picture you're seeing, of a gorilla who is going like this. It's actually a human being in a gorilla suit. And people who are counting basketball passes among the people dressed in white and black shirts often miss the gorilla. The gorilla might be an adverse health effect. It might be a late fee. It might be fine print. It might be some risk you're experiencing, but that is hidden. And to make those visible is often very important. We know that choice architecture is not avoidable. Any website has a choice architecture. And we know that simplification and nudges are often valuable in avoiding serious problems. I'm inspired to see that the UNDP has been all over this topic. And you're seeing right now an intervention that's designed to protect TB patients in Moldova to follow through with medical treatment. And what I'm saying is just words, yes, on a slide. Moldova, medical treatment, they might seem like abstractions, but we're speaking now of our brothers and sisters who have TB, whose life depends on following through with medical treatment. As it turns out, the program that the intervention is designed to fix is one which makes following through with the medical treatment relatively hard. You need doctor visits that have that are an imposition on people's time. And often people are dying because the medical treatment that is demanded of them is intruding on days that they are spending with their children or with their job. And they say, later land, I'm not sure if I'm going to visit. The intervention, which basically simplified the process and removed a step that the patients had to undergo in order to have the treatment, had, on a slide which is slightly obscure admittedly, but under the control treatment, you're getting approximately 40% usage, and under the treatment condition, it's 80% usage. A massive increase. Now, the shift from 40 to 80% is just one indicator of the broader theme that sometimes a seemingly small choice-preserving intervention, which removes the obstacle to treatment, is not an incremental modest step. It's not a 3 or 4 percentage point increase, which is significant and we can declare victory. It's a way of saving lives. There we go. That's a little better. 80%. You see, I'm technologically amazing. And I actually read a book before I got here, which is How Do You Keep an Audience Attention? And it says, pretend that you screwed up the slides. Did it work? Did it work? It worked. What a good book. Okay, this is Behavioral Insights at the United Nations, and what is going to be not abstractions, but life-saving is underway, and it would be good to get going aggressively. Okay, I'm going to give you some practical points right now. That in the US government, remember what the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs does? I gave you a general overview. But what it's done over the past 10, 12 years or so is to put behavioral insights in the minds of department partners. So the Environmental Protection Agency, the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Department of Education, in part because of their own expertise and curiosity, but in part because of their partnership with people in that office, they have the capital stock of behavioral insights. And when they're doing something to try to protect people against, let's say, fraud or exploitation or unclean water or air, they can use a behaviorally informed approach. It's in their minds. You saw the executive orders before, the 13563, 13707, they are binding. There's a memorandum I issued with the name Simplification and Disclosure as Regulatory Tools. That's not a very good name either. At least it's not a number. It calls out basically Olympic gold and Olympic silver and directs the federal government to give consideration to those. The work I didn't do adequately in the government, there's a lot of it, but the one I would single out as my greatest regret is that I wasn't aggressive enough in seeing the extent to which paperwork burdens, which are well motivated, often imposed by lawyers, that's what I am, the lawyers want lots of paperwork, in failing to see the extent to which paperwork burdens are destructive to program goals. And the reduction and automaticity that paperwork burdens prevent, the reduction of paperwork burdens and the conversion to automaticity can make all the difference in the lives of real people. In the United Kingdom, the Behavioral Insights team has a mantra, EAST, which means easy, attractive, social, and timely. It's a brilliant phrase. It's a capturing of behavioral insights, decades really, of empirical work, where making something easier, making it social such that people know what the norm is, making it happen at the right time, and making it attractive can make all the difference. We know that there is often a tendency to use a communication which seems intuitive to the designer, but sometimes the communication is unintelligible to those who see it. And it is imperative to test the communication, even in an informal way, to make sure that people understand it. Sometimes there is interest in having a behavioral insights unit, and sometimes there is interest in having an entity with line authority be the behavioral source. And let me say just a little bit on that. This is a difference between, I think, the prize winner in the United Kingdom in terms of using behavioral insights and what's been the most impactful in my country. So one idea is to have a behavioral team, this you can consider the UK model, which has expertise and knowledge and which is a resource. And if it has credibility and cachet, it can have a large impact on what the rest of the government does. My understanding is that's also what's happening in the Netherlands. In Canada, as well as in the United States, it's mostly a different model. It's where someone with line authority, meaning the power to say, you must do this, is behaviorally informed. And they are not a repository necessarily of experimental capacity, but they know the literature and they say, do this. In Canada, I'm told, and I've worked with authorities there, the ministers often know this material and are directing their staffs to employ it. And it's been spectacularly successful. I'm going to give you a program which I'm going to try to get through without having a tear to my eye. This is a challenging program that bears on several of the Sustainable Development Goals all at once. And it's a program to help children who are poor have lunch and breakfast that they possibly could not get because their parents don't have any money. Now, the consequence of the program ought to be wonderful, where nutritious meals are in the hands and mouths of those kids. Here's the problem with the program. Their parents didn't sign them up. Think to yourself, if you would, what is the remedy for low take-up of a program which could have a massive effect on the lives of poor children, maybe change their lives? What would you do? The program that was adopted is called direct certification. And all it means is that if the school or the locality knows those kids are eligible, they're automatically in. Their parents don't have to sign them up. If their parents don't want them in, they can of course opt out, but they are automatically in. Direct certification in one recent year had 13 million children in it. And that again is an abstraction. But if we had a very small fraction of those children outside of this building marching or standing or looking in, I doubt there would be anyone in the room who would be dry-eyed. It's a program that is on the ground every day of every year, having a big impact. Okay, here's my slogan in the government, and I continue to use it today. It's a little obscure. Plate, not pyramid. I'm going to explain it. This was for a long time the most visited website in the United States government. It's designed to help people to have healthy, nutritious meals, not just children. Imagine you are an adult or a parent or a school teacher trying to figure out what you should be feeding your kids or yourself on the basis of this icon. There's a person, gender unclear. You can't tell if it's a man or a woman, can you? Marching to the top of a pyramid. There's a white space there. Is that death? Is it heaven? Is it thinness? The person has no shoes, that's clear. Yes? Now imagine you're trying to figure out what to eat as the march up to the top continues. You see those stripes, green, red, yellow, blue, violet, I think? Can you connect those stripes to food groups? I can't, and I work on this stuff. I have no idea. Can you see what the foods are? Can you identify the foods so you know what you should be eating? There's one thing that's clearly recognizable, isn't it? Look on the bottom right, if you would. That's a shoe, clearly. Is the government telling citizens, eat your shoe? Okay, this is replaced now by the food plate, which has gone viral. And it says, make half your plate fruits and vegetables, and you're basically there. Now take this mantra of plate, not pyramid, as suggesting that often the failure of a program is a product not of resistance or disagreement, but incomprehension. Often a program that the government in good faith deploys doesn't work because people don't understand it and they put it aside. If we can give them the equivalent of a plate, it's like a GPS device, it's navigable. I'll tell you a little story from the US government, shall I? After we worked on this, a friend of mine who works on foreign policy was engaged in a very complicated negotiation with a foreign country with which the president was personally to be engaged in the following days by visiting that country. If the president of the United States is going to a country, there has to be really some product, sometimes called a deliverable, and we had no deliverable. That's embarrassing. That's terrible. My friend was deputized to go do something, get an agreement. The two countries were blocked. I called my friend on the day of the negotiation and I asked, how did it go? And her answer was, great. That was a surprise. So I said, why? And she said, plate, not pyramid. I had no more understanding of that than you did. And she said, I tell you what I mean by that. The reason the US government and the other nation had been at loggerheads was we had been presenting them something like a pyramid, and they had no idea what we wanted. So they said no. Then we gave them 14 things that were clear and crisp, and their answer was, well, 7 of those are good. We'll do them. The suggestion was that often government's failure to meet a goal is that the people with whom we are dealing don't know particularly what's being sought. I'm going to end with the best nudge in the English language by a behavioral expert before his time, the greatest English language poet of the 20th century, William Butler Yeats, who said, "Do not wait to strike till the iron is hot, but make it hot by striking." Wisdom for us all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sunstein. It's fascinating not only to hear what behavioral insights and what concepts were successful while in your time in government, but also insights on how you can actually institutionalize it and what methodologies you can use so that organizations and large bureaucracies start using it as well. So for the Q&A section, we're expecting a lively discussion, and I would like to invite on stage one more person, Rafael Obregon, who is a technical expert at UNICEF. He leads the communication for developing section in UNICEF's program division. And as part of his work, he supports government and civil service organizations apply community engagement and behavior change strategies. His background is in communication and international development, and as such, he's supporting the integration of behavioral insights into UNICEF's work. I would also call out Benjamin Kumpf, who is here in the audience with us. He's a technical expert from UNDP side. He leads the UNDP Innovation Facility, a small venture inside UNDP, and they have a dedicated fund and portfolio of projects in innovation, and they're pushing behavioral insights quite strongly. They're leaders in the field for sure, and in the UN family. Ben's background is in psychology, which is, I suspect, somewhat related to his passion for behavioral insights and for bringing them to the UN. So this is an amazing panel that we have right here, and all of them will be happy to take your questions. Because I know that the first couple of minutes of Q&A can be a bit awkward, I'm going to get it started, just that behavioral nugget there. And I want to ask all of you if you could share 2 minutes of where do you think BI is best placed to make a difference in the context of the 2030 agenda? Please start.
Poverty reduction, I would say, is number one, that all over the world, people are struggling to make ends meet, and sometimes it involves hunger, sometimes it involves support for their children. And the fact is that programs designed to relieve poverty are often failures, not because of poor intentions, but because of bad choice architecture. And to be conscious of the extent to which people are struggling economically, are dealing with 1,001 different problems, such that if the program is for them another problem to be solved, a hurdle, rather than something that has a kind of seamlessness, that is a game changer.
Rafael, would you like to say where you think BI can make a difference? Or?
Well, I must say that at UNICEF, as Cynthia mentioned earlier, we've been using various behavior change strategies to support our programmatic priorities, and obviously in the context of the SDGs, we are looking at different options to address multiple issues across the different programmatic priorities of the organization. So certainly, any issue that relates to children, that affects children and adolescents in the context of the SDGs, is of great importance to the organization. And what we have been doing over the last couple of years is looking at new tools, new approaches that can help us accelerate results in those areas. And behavioral insights is precisely one of them. We've used various approaches, various theories, but certainly 2 years ago we came in contact with the UN Behavioral Insights Unit and started looking at how we could integrate behavioral insights into our work. And Professor Laurie Foster, who was a member of that team, has been collaborating with us to think about what are the key areas where behavioral insights can help us take some of our interventions to scale and address some of these critical issues. So we are very excited about bringing behavioral insights more specifically into our toolbox, and also collaborating with our colleagues in the innovations office, who are constantly looking at new platforms, new technologies that can help us reach large numbers of young people and communities, and by using behavioral informed interventions, then address some of those challenges. So for us, the specific use of BI is relatively new, but certainly what is not new is the use of behavioral approaches, and we are looking forward to taking this work to our field offices in collaboration with Professor Foster. One last thing that I want to say, obviously, in the context of Professor Sunstein's presentation, is the policy dimension. And I think that that's a critical difference in terms of what we do. We tend to be looking at specific interventions in the context of our programmatic work, but I think that the policy dimension that you bring to the use of behavioral insights is so critical, because it really makes this scalable automatically, sustainable, and certainly more cost effective in many ways. I think that's something that we have to look at in terms of how we connect with policy issues in the context of this new work that we're doing.
Thank you, MC. No, I was inspired, Gus, by what you said when you say that throwing money into an issue, a problem, or a phenomenon might not be the solution. And I always say that, and we have been having this fixation that having the $1 trillion would be delivering the SDG goods. I would submit that a more powerful currency than the money is behavior. And by the way, there's a work we have to do as the UN. How do we go inside these 17 goals and see how we can change behaviors? For me, they are more potent into getting to the goals. Let me just give an example. Yesterday, we're having an innovation discussion with young people, and they were giving us example of how changing behaviors can impact on the SDGs. Just two of them. One young Mexican had the idea of recycling tires, and he gave us the figures how recycling tires would not only have economic impact, creating charcoal that is not polluting, and then you could see the metrics, how it reduced pollution in Mexico, just by changing behavior. And there was another kid, I think from South Africa, who told us how managing the food chains can impact on waste and on nutrition. We have poor people that can't have food, yet there's waste plenty there. So how, by just changing the behavior, sometimes the incentive systems. He was telling us that in his country, when you waste, you are heavily taxed. So, but just by facilitating the recycling of waste, not only you gain out of your budget, but you impact on people. Where the money, where the surplus of food was used in school, a hospital, and so on and so forth. So I'm sure that for each one of these 17 goals, if we try to find the nudge, nudging the SDGs, I think for me it's more powerful than funding the SDGs. I'm taking a risky stance here, but I think that's my feeling out of Gus' statement.
How about you, Ben? What do you think is the most promising area for BI?
I'd say not the most promising one, but the one where I'm most intrigued with, because I think it's the biggest accelerator, is SG5. Investing heavily in gender equality, in girls' education, will have positive ripple effects across all SDGs, and it's the right thing to do. And I would always argue that requires political struggles, it requires policy changes. But way too often, in my perception, we in the UN family address on changing attitudes, our interventions. And I think a good complementary to that is changing concrete behaviors and creating so much cognitive dissonance, particularly among men, that an attitude shift might follow. And small examples that we have been tinkering around with, if, for example, we know that there's a lot of displayed chauvinist behavior by, let's say, members of the police force vis-a-vis survivors of gender-based violence during testimonies. Just having small interventions such as making it mandatory for those policemen to have a picture of their families up on their front and seeing that changes behavior. In addition to other interventions, I'm not arguing that technical solutions will get us to SDG 5. But, for example, having men sign a public pledge to not be a bystander, but to intervene, I think can have real small changes to a complex problem. And now I can't resist but saying that actually commitment devices, including public pledges, are supposed to be really powerful. I signed one to never be on an all-male panel. And here I sit. And I don't know what to do about it.
Okay, here's something on gender equality. I think this is an electrifying finding, and it's very recent. It's from Saudi Arabia. And the intervention involved asking young Saudi Arabian men whether they would be comfortable with their women and their wives in the workforce. And the answer was generally yes, they are comfortable. And they were asked what they thought other young Saudi men thought. And they said they thought people like me are not comfortable with their wives in the workforce. And in Saudi Arabia, my understanding is that men have authority over whether their wives are in the workforce. Okay, so you see a disjunction. The Saudi men are fine with their wives working. They're positive about it, but they think that they are violating the social norm. Now, the intervention is informing the young, truly, it's an accurate information, informing young Saudi men that men like them are fine with wives working outside the home in the workforce. The result of that intervention was to increase significantly the number of women who were applying for jobs and working months later. So what makes that, I think, so interesting, of course, the veto norm, if it does exist, as I understand it does, is not something that I think should be applauded. But the fact that young Saudi men actually believe more in sex equality than they think is the norm. And once they're informed that the norm is much more pro-sex equality than they thought, then they're willing to act on the basis of what they privately believe. Now, I think that all over the world, there are men who are acting in accordance with norms of sex inequality, who actually do not approve of those norms and abhor them, but they live in accordance with them. And there's an opportunity there.
Absolutely, and I think that's why the diagnosis is so critical in behavioral interventions, really understanding what is happening and why people are not acting the way that you would expect them to. So now I would like to open it up. If you can please, do we have a microphone or can we share? Thank you.
Thank you for that, Kani Vignaraja from DOCO. So two quick reflections and the kind of questions as well, probably to Professor Sunstein, but also anyone else. The default option, you're signed up. I think maybe there are some instances where that may come up against the right to choose issue. So would you see that as being workable and the best option or the gold medal winner when it's also, there's reminders and public information that you are signed up and you have a right to opt out? So that's one. The second is bringing it home to the UN. Where although we are 60+ members, we have various clubs and tribes within the UN. And to be a member of some of those, the question would be whether you give a member an opt-out of the whole or opt-out based on certain parts of the membership responsibilities. And what we've found by going with the latter, it's a race to the bottom because everyone opts out of things they don't like, which is the place where we need the most discipline.
Okay, those are great questions. So you're completely right that if people have an opt-out right, but they aren't aware of it, and through inadvertence, they have a right to opt out is essential. For the children's program that you saw, to send text reminders every hour that you can opt out probably wouldn't be worth it. But to notify parents is a very good idea, and it's respectful of their autonomy. So agreed entirely. You an example, I need to be less ignorant to give a better answer, but if I tracked your comment, you're pointing to the fact that sometimes there's a collective action problem where opt-out rights can make everything disintegrate. So people don't have a right to opt out of paying taxes, and people don't have a right to opt out of helping to fund air quality. We just had a very significant increase. I have to do a little arithmetic. It might be by an infinite percent of the number of women on the panel bracketing the house. But if it's the case that the existence of the opt-out rate means the disintegration of the enterprise, then on standard economic grounds, that's a reason for you got to be there.
I just want to introduce quickly Malika, who is Ben's partner in crime at the UNDP Innovation Facility, and to thank Ben for standing up to the pledge that he took. Another question, yes, sir?
My name is Robert Cohen. I had the privilege to attend the Social and Behavior Change Communication Summit in Bali, bringing together many people involved in, interested in behavior and social change. And one of the sections of the final declaration addresses a question I have. It says, "We believe that the credibility of our field rests on transparency regarding who decides how social and behavior change investments get prioritized, which behaviors or social norms should be changed, and in whose interest." So the question I have, by the way, I'm a true believer in behavior insights and in nudges, but the question is, who nudges and whose insights? If we're talking about people-led development, the scientists, the experts, are coming up with these fabulous insights and basically nudging. Anyway, the question is clear.
Yes.
Okay, so the question would be, it's a great question and a very important question. And it's most searing, I think, with respect to mandates and bans. So the concern about the identity of the agent of the instrument and also of the transparency of the agent is most essential when you're talking about a mandate or a prohibition. Insofar as we're speaking of freedom-preserving interventions, those requirements are still very important, but they don't have the built-in safety valve. With respect to freedom-preserving interventions, there's a built-in safety valve. People can say no.
when do we eat those chips? When do we binge watch on Netflix? They want to know our consumer behavior. And our behavior is constantly being shaped by other actors, and we are constantly making decisions. And we don't even know it. And I think being very cognizant of what those sciences are at play and helping people make the best decisions in their interest, that's a role that we can play as the UN and as UN entities. But I do have a question, if that's okay. We're very of it. Being a practitioner, what can it not do? What are our limiting parameters? Where should we look? Yeah, let me stop there.
It can't keep the increase in global climate below 2 degrees centigrade by 2100. And the climate change, it can help with climate change, but it can't get us where the scientists say we want to go. And that has a general lesson, which is which pollution is a defining example. You can't do everything with freedom-preserving approaches. It may be that the mandates and bans that are necessary or the incentives that are necessary will be behaviorally informed, but you'll need more aggressive instruments. For poverty reduction, I'm very excited about how much can be achieved through behaviorally informed approaches. We're really, I think, in the infancy of knowledge and practice. But poverty reduction will take helping people get training and education, and that will take resources as well as behavioral knowledge.
We're running out of time, but I know both Mar and Raphael have something to add very quickly. We also have 2 more questions, and we'll conclude with that.
Mine is quick.
Unfortunately, I think we can take 2 more questions. But first, if you can add something more, and then.
It's not a question, but to preamble it by trying to give an insight on Kani's questions. I always believe in when designing policies to be mindful of what I said earlier, and you said it in your papers, the Lockean acclamation. Who are you to tell me what to do? And when you do UN development system reforms, agency, even in the subliminal mind, are telling us, who are you to tell me what to do? It means that when we design policies based on insights, it has to be in a co-construction manner. And I was going to ask you a question. When you help presidents design memorandums or directives based on what you anticipate as the behavior, do you co-construct with the actors, and how do you do it?
Raphael, yeah, I know you had something to add.
Well, actually, I had a comment which goes along the same lines in terms of as we try to integrate behavioral insights, an important dimension for us is the rights-based perspective that we use in UNICEF, given our mandate in the CRC as our fundamental sort of guiding document. And one thing that we are trying to build into the process is precisely this notion of co-construction, co-creation, in terms of what is it that we need to focus on, and then how we deploy whatever approach is going to be used. So that's a critical piece, and certainly your further thoughts on that will be very interesting to hear as well. One question that I have in the context of the title of the panel, from my understanding, the uptake of this approach has been much greater in industrialized nations, in wealthier countries. Why has it not had the same level of traction in, let's say, in countries that, to a certain extent, might benefit a lot more from progress on the SDGs? Of course, it's universal, but certainly in some countries it would be much more critical. So what's the reason behind that, if that is the case?
Both great. So I think I'd say on the co-construction, the answer is yes, and it's essential. Partly for legitimacy, but partly for maybe even more important for not making a mistake. So that if you do something that is seems like a good idea, and there's some academic papers that support it, but you don't know what's happening on the ground, you can get it wrong. So to talk to people is essential. On the industrialized wealthy countries, keep in mind that the use of behavioral insights in an institutionalized way, even in the United Kingdom and Canada and the Netherlands and Ireland, these are all world leaders, it's basically yesterday. It's really recent. And though there's been phenomenal work done in the United Kingdom and Ireland and the Netherlands, they did it last week. Given the span of human history, we're talking recent years. And the interest in, I'll just name some countries where I know there is keen interest, in India and Rwanda and Mexico and Colombia, all countries with which I've been in communication, is intense. And the amount of expertise in Rwanda and India and Mexico and Colombia is extremely impressive. So it may be that they don't have formal teams, but they're using the ideas with good results.
Absolutely. So we are already at our time, but I see there's interest in asking more questions. So I'm going to go rogue and take 2 more questions. If you have to go, feel free to go. So if we can hear 2 questions and then ask the speakers to answer those, and then we'll conclude after that.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you, for your talks, your remarks today. I'm Chelsea Malden. I'm the director of the Public Policy Lab, which is an innovation lab for government based here in New York City. And we've spent the last 8 years working with municipal and federal agencies here in the US. And one thing that we've observed in designing new policies and services is that it's not just the behavioral biases of members of the public that impede implementation, but the loss, subversion, and the present bias and the lack of informational context on the part of policymakers and operations leaders. Can you think of examples in any of your work where behavioral nudges have been used explicitly to alter policy-making choices by policymakers?
Great. So I was at the University of Chicago for a long time, and there was one faculty member, a very important faculty member, who in response to any new idea would say either, "We did that," or "We never did that." And that exhausted the possibilities. And I've seen that in governments also. So Executive Order 13563 is really, remember that one? Remember those numbers? That is a choice architecture for choice architects. And it has basically 5 principles, one of which is public participation, and it is very aggressive in calling for public participation as a way of counteracting potential biases on the part of government itself. You saw it calls up for the use of behaviorally informed tools. It places a spotlight on scientific integrity and the separation of scientific judgments from policy judgments. And it is very focused on requiring government to catalog the costs and benefits of what it's proposing to do, which is an impetus for testing, testing, testing. And that was, this again, President Trump has embraced it. It's not partisan at all. It's a way of having an architecture, a nudge for nudgers.
Is it being implemented? Sorry. Is it being implemented using behavioral practices? Are policymakers receiving a weekly SMS message suggesting that they look at Executive Order 13563? I mean, what is the actual...
You remember the number? That's amazing. Yes. So there's a mechanism where if the Environmental Protection Agency wants to do the poverty reduction program from the Department of Agriculture, it has to show compliance with the principles of 13563. There's even something called regulatory analysis checklist. It's not a very famous document, but it's 2 pages, which is basically you've got to do this, 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 this. It's really simple.
Fantastic. We have one more question here at the front end, then we must really wrap up.
Thank you. My name is Anil Chaudhary. I'm from Bangladesh, on the innovation lab called A2I. I'm running it for the last 10 years. my question has to do with SDG 4, because I think that's one of the most important SDGs to influence other SDGs. What are we actually producing in our school system? Who are going to solve the problems with other SDGs? In February of this year, we ran a small experiment. We brought in the education disruptors in one room and the traditionalists in another room, and asked them to draw a picture of the future of education and the future of learning. Both groups do the same picture for the future of learning. So it's open, collaborative, participatory, coming in from all sorts of social media, outside of classrooms. They actually broke down classrooms. The disruptors drew the same picture for the future of education. The traditionalists, which actually included our curriculum writers, textbook writers, UNICEF, Save the Children, they drew a school. They couldn't think of anything other than a school with teachers and curriculum and textbooks and traditional assessments. Now, the two problems there. One is that the people who are actually writing the education system, designing it, they can't think of anything other than what exists for the last 100 years. The parents are not going to let their children go to the schools run by the disruptors because they think it's too high a risk. So what behavior nudges can be created for the designers and for the consumers, if it's possible?
It's a big issue. So one question I'd ask, consistent with the previous question, is, are we clear that the disruptors are right? The parents to try it. Let's stipulate that we are clear. There are some kind of tools that tend to work. One is to emphasize what the parents have to lose if they don't go this route. So losses are much more effective in motivating behavior generally than gains. So to say your students are going to lose out on the future if they don't try this. And the other is to emphasize the emerging social norm in favor of going in the disruptive direction. So if you can say that the most education conscious people like you are trying this, then invocation of the social norm can have a very large impact on behavior. We know that one way to reduce opioid prescriptions in various countries is to notify the doctors who are doing the most opioid prescriptions that they're in the top tier of opioid prescribers. And this could show something with education, that the top tier, so to speak, of parents are going this route. Would you like to join them?
So unfortunately, we've had a fantastic conversation today, but our time is up. It's great to see so much appetite for behavioral insights and to understand how we could apply it more in our day-to-day work. To conclude, a few themes from the day are: one, behavioral insights is a tool that can be applied to promote the Sustainable Development Goals, but more than a tool, it can be a lens that we can use to design programs from the start, not just a tweak here and there, but thinking about how we can put ourselves in the shoes of the people who will benefit from this. How do we co-create with them and design in a way that takes into account their needs, their wants, and their desires, and essentially bring them along with this behaviorally informed approach. Thanks everyone for participating and for our amazing panel. Again, if you can join me, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.